Religion is something we can learn about in many different forms of media. Today, I will be discussing it as it's portrayed in movies. Those that movies that you may not have heard of, or you may have. I'll be talking about The Last Temptation of Christ, directed by Martin Scorsese. It's quite the popular movie. It stars Willem Dafoe, big fan of him. I'll be discussing Bilal, A New Breed of Hero. It's an animated film depicting the birth of Islam. And I will be talking about 7 years in Tibet, discussing an Austrian man going to Tibet and learning about the Buddhist culture there, Tibetan Buddhist culture. And before we get into the movies and the rankings, which I'll be ranking based on how I liked the movie, how they represented cultures, if the cultures themselves felt embraced by it, or if they disagreed, interpretations of the movie. And we'll be also talking about religious acceptance that Cantwell Smith discussed during our class period. We're going to be talking about religious acceptance and different ways religion is portrayed in the media and kind of what that does for us. So, the first movie we'll be talking about is The Last Temptation of Christ, directed by Martin Scorsese. Just off rip, it's a pretty controversial movie. Some consider it blasphemous. It tells the story of Jesus of Nazareth. Basically, it's his whole life up until towards the end, where he's tempted one last time by a guardian angel, which he believes is his guardian angel, and he goes on to live a happy life. However, it is shown by God later that there will be a mass destruction of the world if Jesus does not sacrifice himself. So he does end up dying for humanity's sins. However, only after living a life and falling for Satan's tricks. So people find this very blasphemous, very controversial. However, I do believe this kind of gives us our first look into what I was talking about interpretation and religious acceptance. You see a lot of different groups coming at this movie from a lot of different lights. Some people, blasphemous, does not follow the Gospels, but others see it as this way of humanizing Christ. He was, doubtful of his religion. He wasn't sure if he was ready to jump in and take the leap of faith. And I think that speaks to a lot of people in a way. It's a very powerful way of, humanizing Christ. And it's an interesting concept when you're speaking of such a holy figure who is so prominent in a religion. But it's all about kind of how you view it. And that's kind of what I'm wanting to get at here. We all have such different opinions, and we kind of get caught up in our own world sometimes. And it doesn't mean necessarily that you have to believe in it, or even you can deem it blasphemous if that is what you believe, and that's perfectly okay. But I think this is such a prominent example of how sometimes we don't tolerate the religious views of others, which Cantwell Smith gets at. And I think we covered a little bit talking about Pumpkin Brown and Pentecostal snake churches in West Virginia, talking about how some people didn't think that's how that verse was interpreted, and that's not the right way to interpret such a thing. But I think that's unfair to say that. Overall, I liked the movie. I think it was pretty good. A little bit controversial, that's going to deduct some points. I think I'm going to give it a 6.5 out of 10. Willem Dafoe's awesome. Love him. All right, this next movie is 7 Years in Tibet. It's a little bit more of a story piece when we're talking about the religious aspects of it versus The Last Temptation of Christ being a more controversial look on things. This movie is more about acceptance, and I think it was received pretty well. It was directed by Jean-Jacques Annaud, and it stars Brad Pitt. Talks about the ties in religious acceptance and views primarily through its portrayal of Tibetan Buddhism and the transformation of the main character, who is Brad Pitt, an Austrian hiker who seeks to gain glory for his people. So the main character basically shows up and is very dismissive. He doesn't really care about the culture too much, but then he befriends a young Dalai Lama, who is a political leader, but he's also a deeply spiritual figure in the society, and they kind of start to forge this relationship. And the main character, whose name is Horror, becomes a little bit more mindful and has a little more compassion and humility for the people around him, and starting to adopt policies of nonviolence and seeing where they truly come from. There's also an aspect of this that kind of ties into something we talked about with the way North Vietnam reacted to the war that happened, and the way they used spiritual mediums, not necessarily spiritual mediums, but practices to cope with the violence that had been going on and that happened in the past. So we kind of see a contrast here from Tibetan Buddhism versus the violence of World War II, which is going on at this time. And there's an invasion on the temple, and it's basically just anarchy. But they don't let that knock them down, and they continue to practice their, treating all beings with respect. There's a scene where they're moving a worm, like from a construction site. It continues to illustrate that sense of spiritual acceptance and love that basically helps everyone move forward strongly. And I think that's kind of also tying back into Cantwell Smith again, something that we can all learn from in accepting everyone despite the negativity of the outside world. I think that's what this movie's trying to get at, and it's a very powerful message. I like this movie very much, actually. It was pretty good. I like Brad Pitt. Despite how he may be in real life, he's a great actor. The message is very powerful. It's prominent. It's pretty clear and concise with, the way it contrasts peace and violence. It's a powerful message. I think we could all learn a little bit something from it. It's paced pretty well. It's a pretty good movie. So I'll give it a 7 out of 10. So the last movie we will be talking about is called Bilal, A New Breed of Hero. It basically follows this young boy, Bilal. It's set in 7th century Arabia. He was a slave. He's growing up under a cruel and wealthy, oppressive merchant. And through faith and strength, he kind of breaks free and becomes the first caller to prayer in Muslim history. So it's kind of like not super Islamic. It kind of strays away from preaching, if that's the right way to put it, and kind of fights more towards being strong. It's about the broader struggle of humans and their struggle for freedom and dignity. So it's like kind of avoiding that over preaching and limiting it to one religion, which I think is, pretty cool, that everybody can enjoy this movie. Not necessarily that if you are of a religious background, you can't enjoy a religious view of another, but it kind of limits that aspect to a certain degree for those who aren't interested and can learn a story about a boy who, beat all the odds. And this also has like a big anti-discrimination theme, which is back to Cantwell Smith, that not religious tolerance, but religious understanding of other people. Bilal was a slave, and now he's a respected leader who fights against racism, religious intolerance as well as an aspect of it. And he fights against it actively. This movie, if anything, is preaching religious acceptance of everyone and, just speaking out against what's wrong and accepting human rights, which kind of aligns today with, like, what we're trying to do, especially in these environments where we're learning more about other people's religions and cultures. We're trying to learn something new and not be so ignorant. And I think this movie does a great job with conveying that message through a fun animated story that kids can enjoy, anybody can enjoy. It's a simple concept. It's a great story. I really enjoyed it. I liked the message, promoting all the anti-discrimination, and yeah, it was pretty good. I'll give it a 7 out of 10. Yeah, that's kind of about it. I think it's a really cool way of exploring religion and culture by watching movies. I'm glad I participated in this project and did it this way. I love movies. I think it's a great way to open your mind to all kinds of different things. I've been watching all kinds of different movies for a couple years now, trying to expand my horizons a little bit. It's a great way to learn visually, musically. Yeah, I think it was a lot of fun doing this. Professor, thank you very much. I had a great time this semester. I hope you have a good summer.